The best Fortnite teams in the world are all trying to play in the storm for as long as they possibly can, and on the surface, the idea makes a lot of sense. If everyone else is fighting inside the safe circle, staying in the storm means there's no one around to shoot you. But there's one problem. What happens when everyone starts playing in the storm? In the EU FNCS Grand Finals, when the 5th zone appeared, on average 64% of the lobby was still in the storm. But the FNCS winners realized something that the rest of the lobby didn't, and that was that the storm meta was outdated. The most valuable time to play the storm is during the partial zones, as you can skip the most difficult part of high-level competitive Fortnite. These are zones 5, 6, and 7, where the zone is half in and half out. This is because everyone from the previous zone is forced into this edge of the circle that creates what's called the congested side. Then rotating from here is extremely difficult. Let's take the first game of EU Grand Finals and look at how difficult this rotate is for Ivan and Hizix. From their position in the 4th zone, they pull the 5th. Then the 6th zone pulls to the south, which is max distance for them. They overdrive grenade and immediately get beamed for 100 by Sayaz and Scary, meaning Ivan then has to use 2 of his 3 big pots to heal. Now, since they are the last team to rotate into the 6th zone, they start to get lobby focused by the rest of the players who have already rotated in. They survive, but now have to use the last of their shield. Unfortunately, they just didn't make it in, so they need to build a few boxes in again, so they get lobby focused for a second time. On top of this, because they've taken so much damage on this long rotate, they're now below the storm surge threshold and they are just getting ticked. Ivan goes down, leaving Hizix as a solo who's now 300 below the storm surge threshold. To make matters worse, the 7th zone, the next one, pulls completely max distance for them again, so if Hizix somehow survives, the same rotate is probably going to happen to them yet again. He dies, by the way. Rotating these partial zones, if you pull a max zone, is really tough, and there are so many players that can get in your way, they can hold you, they can shoot you, and even the best of the best players will take some damage and use a lot of materials on these kind of rotates. They are just very hard. Now, the way to work around this is to get to the center of the 5th zone. From here, no matter where the zone pulls, you can have the shortest possible rotate. Look at how easy this rotate is for Cringe and Twy. The 6th zone pulls south in this exact same game from the example we just showed, and then they spend some time getting storm surge damage, and then all they need to do is use a single overdrive grenade, slide, and box up. From the position they were at, no matter where the zone pulled, they would have a pretty easy rotate. The other alternatives, rather than going to the center, is to go over to the dead side. Since the 5th zone pulled to the east of the 4th, this means that the east side would typically become the dead side. So by going deep into the east, teams like Volko and Cringe here have a free rotate. They only took 40 damage on this entire rotate, a little bit less than Ivan and Hizix. This is a different Cringe, by the way, from the previous example. There are 2. Now, getting to the center of 5th or into dead side sounds easy, but the difficulty is consistently getting into these positions in every single match. And this is where Storm comes in. Over the years, there have been a lot of different strategies for this, like in 2024 when Peterbot and Poyo won the Global Championship. They used forecasts to show one zone ahead of them, and then they go up onto the Loot Island and use Fizz launch pads, and the next zone would show whilst they were in the air, so they could just land in the best position one zone ahead. In 2025, when Queasy, Swizzy, and Merstash won the FNCS Global Championship, they traded early surge and then just played medkits in the storm until the 5th zone appeared, so they could just choose a really good position in basically every game. And then in FNCS Major 1 of this year, Sky and Scroll basically did the exact same thing and adapted the strategy for duos and really made it very popular. So the strategy they popularized is very simple. You play medkits in the storm until the 5th zone appears, rotate to the center or dead side, and then you have a priority rotate to a good position in the 6th zone, and then again you'll have another good rotation into the 7th. But the thing is, this worked for Sky and Scroll last season, but when you win an FNCS with a strategy, most people tend to copy this. From Major 1 to Major 2, which was only around a 3 months difference, there was a 31% increase in time spent in the storm. In the 5th zone specifically, there was an average of 64% of players in the storm, which is almost 2/3 of the lobby, and a pretty big increase from the 45% that was in Major 1. I went through almost every single match from both majors and individually counted all of the players in the storm for every single zone to figure this out, by the way, so I definitely appreciate it if you subscribed. The thing is though, it wasn't really just the good players that were playing the storm. There was only an increase of time spent in the storm of 9% from the top 10 teams on the leaderboard from Major 1 to Major 2. However, there was a 25% increase from the bottom half of the lobby. Basically, there were a lot of teams trying this strategy and failing. If you look at the way players should be distributed over a 5th zone, this is what you'd typically expect. This zone pulled to the east of the 4th, similar to the game we just watched, so you can see how the vast majority of players end up on the west side. This is quite a low-level competitive match. I literally just looked in NA West's last chance open qualifiers, picked a random game until I found this. So in this kind of match, the storm strategy would work, but this is what it looks like in the EU FNCS Grand Finals. Very confusing. The zone pools here are pretty similar to the NA West match, but instead of there being congestion on the west side, there's congestion on the south. Now this is because this zone was to the north of the map, so a lot of the players were playing Storm below it, meaning that when they had to rotate into the 5th zone, they all tried to get into a good position, but instead just all ended up on the south side, which actually created a new congested side. The goal of playing Storm is to get to a good position away from other players in the 5th zone, but because so many people are trying this, they've all rotated to the same area, ruining the strat. But that poses an obvious question. How did Sky and Scroll win FNCS again if their entire strategy from Major 1 has been ruined by the rest of the lobby? Well, they land at Frosted Flats, and this POI is insane for many reasons that we'll cover throughout the rest of this video, but one of the main things is just the speed at which they can loot. There's really fast harvesting metal and brick, tons of chests, but most importantly, there's a lot of gold. There's a lot of furniture in Frosted Flats that drops gold when broken, which means that they can buy the entire stock of chug jugs from the vending machines in literally every single game. In Game 3, they bought a gold burst AR from the Weapon-O-Mag as well, which costs 1,500 gold, and they bought max AR ammo. Now, replay bugs when the gold goes over 1,000, it just says infinite, but it's safe to say that they're getting around 3,000 to 4,000 gold every single game, so they can get the best loot as fast as they want. 2.5 minutes after they've landed, they already have capped loot and capped materials. Now compare this to everyone else in the lobby. For reference, I'm just cycling between random players' inventories here, and at this point in the match, there isn't a single team who has capped mats and loot like this. Sky and Scroll's off spawn at Frosted Flats is just so much faster than everyone else's. So because of this, in all 4 matches with the zone pools to the north, they left Frosted Flats and headed for the snowy hill near their drop spot. Here there is a ton of fast harvesting brick around them to refarm, so they can both just stay capped mats once they've built their surge base. In Game 1 and Game 9, they got this position uncontested because of how fast they were to loot. However, in Game 3, they were beaten to this spot by Nebs and Nathan. So instead of going up here, they just sat in the bush at the bottom of the hill and 3-2-1 walks who rotated by. Then they used all of the extra materials to claim the hill anyway. And lastly, in the final match, Nathan and Nebs also got this hill before Sky and Scroll, so they just W-keyed them. They'd already won the FNCS at this point because they were so far ahead of second place. They'd even tweeted that they won FNCS before the final match, so they can make any play they want and W-key. So in every game the zone pulled north, they took this hill, and this hill is really important because when the zone's pulled to the north, it's pretty much bang in the center of the first zone. And look at how that plays out for them in Game 1, the match we've already looked at earlier in this video. They pretty much just sit here getting Storm Surge tags until the 5th zone appears, so they don't move for 9.5 minutes. Then they just use a single overdrive grenade to go to the 5th zone. Then from this position, they can just hold all of those teams rotating in from the storm. So because they're slightly away from the edge of the zone, they've essentially countered their own strategy from the previous season. Now from this game, we already know that the 6th zone pulled south, so they barely need to move from this spot, but what's really interesting is then how they play around this max 7th zone that goes south. They've played this game really well, but still end up in a congested side just based on the way that the zones have pulled. And we already know how tough those rotations are. So what they do is they wait for the storm to catch up, and then they overdrive grenade west, away from the lobby and deep into the storm. They play their chug jugs that they bought earlier on to survive, and then they just overdrive grenade again to get into the 7th zone, essentially skipping this entire rotate. A lot of the other teams couldn't do this rotate because they played so much storm earlier and either don't have white heals to do this, or they would die to storm sickness because they stayed in the storm for so long. However, because Sky and Scroll just ran to the center of first zone and then didn't play storm, this allows them to play the storm in the end game instead. And the thing is, this wasn't just a trend that we saw in EU either. These are the players who spent the most time in Storm from NA Central, and here's where they placed on the leaderboard. Notice the specific lack of top 10s. Well, if we go to the bottom instead, you'll see that both first and second place teams barely spent any time in the storm, and then the teams who did spend less time in the storm than them weren't really alive for long enough to play in the storm. So basically, first and second place from NA spent some of the least time in the storm. Now, if you pick almost any game from Grand Finals and just go to the 2nd zone, you'll almost guaranteed see Acorn and Bolt and Ritual and Cold, first and second place, just sitting in the center. Now, Acorn and Bolt also landed at Frosted Flats, the same as Sky and Scroll, and after looting here quickly, they use overdrive grenades just to book it to the center of 2nd zone, irrespective of where it is. From here, they guarantee that they pull the 3rd zone, and if they don't pull the 4th zone, their rotation still won't be that far anyway. By putting a lot of focus into going to the center of these early zones, there's just less players around them when they rotate, so these rotates aren't even difficult. So even on bad zone pools, most of the lobby's in the storm anyway, so these teams who are going center early just get pretty free rotates. And this is why the positioning of Frosted Flats is really key. Because it's relatively close to the center of the map, they have the opportunity to get to the center of the 2nd zone, almost irrespective of where the zone pulls. However, had they chosen a drop spot on the complete edge of the map, they'd be forced to play the storm on far rotates. And then the same can also be said about Ritual and Cold, who landed in Battlewoods, as this drop spot's also close to the center of the map. What's really funny is this is basically basically how teams played back in Chapter 2, when the zones were a little bit different. Everyone just ran to the center of 3rd zone, as this gave you the best chance to pull the 4th and 5th zones. So the teams performing the best on the major regions are just choosing mid-map drop spots, and then just running to the center of zone to counter the storm meta. However, I very specifically said that Sky and Scroll don't play the storm when the zones pool north, but they do actually play the storm in other zone pools. But to get around everyone else copying their strategy, they've evolved it. Now, if you enter the storm in the 2nd zone, as they did in Major 1, you'll be able to stay there until the 5th zone, as you can't stay longer due to storm sickness. But because Frosted is close to the center of the map, they can Surge Tower here, and then even if the zone pools far, they won't enter the storm until the 3rd zone instead of the 2nd. In this match, the zones pool central, so they base inside of Frosted. They're able to stay here until the 4th zone without going into the storm. However, the 5th pool is completely max distance for them. They wait until the zone starts closing and then overdrive northeast, again away from the rest of the lobby. Here they're planning for the worst case scenario where the 6th zone pulls to the north again, as then they could wrap into the center from this position. Instead, it pulls back south. Now the 6th zone deals 5 damage per second, but because they've entered the storm so late, they can survive by using medkits and overdrive grenades without getting storm sickness. This means they can rotate all the way into the center of the 6th zone without getting storm sickness, basically being one of the last teams to actually emerge into the safe circle. Sure, they use all the medkits, so they come with an empty inventory slot, they use a lot of overdrive grenades, and they use some chug jug each, but playing the storm to get to this position sets up their endgame perfectly. Now, just before the 7th zone appears, there are a total of 5,051 materials held by all players. Then by the end of the 7th zone, this is down by 39%, with each duo on average using 54 builds to rotate the 7th zone. However, since Sky and Scroll were centered on the 6th zone, as soon as the 7th zone appears, they just use one overdrive grenade and then make a single box. They're not quite in the zone yet, but once the zone opens up, they then just repeat this again to get into the center of the 7th zone. On the 7th zone rotate, they used 27 builds total, when on average every other team is using 54. So because they went into the storm later into the game, they were one of the last teams to leave the storm, allowing them to choose a good spot in the 6th zone rather than choosing a good spot in the 5th. And you can see how this makes every single endgame rotate easier as well. FNCS winners countered the storm meta by either just running to the center of 2nd zone or by playing storm much later than everyone else. But as important as your positioning is, knowing when to rotate is actually much more important. This concept is called zone priority, and I have a full video covering it and how to master it, which you can watch by clicking right here.